In August of 2023, in a dusty barn on the forgotten edge of Knox County, Ohio, a forge that had been cold for 47 years was sold for $400. The listing, typed in 12-point Times New Roman on a sheet of paper taped to a rusty hay rake, was unceremonious. Blacksmithing equipment, forge, anvil, tools, as is, $400. Included in that lot, resting face down on the anvil as if its owner had merely stepped away for lunch, was a hammer. To the auctioneer, a man from a Columbus firm who specialized in liquidating rural properties, it was just another piece of antiquated junk. To the handful of prospective buyers who shuffled through the barn that morning, kicking at piles of scrap and peering into cobwebbed crates, it was an obstacle on the anvil's surface, to be nudged aside to check for cracks in the steel face. The hammer was not considered an item in its own right. It was an inclusion, a footnote to a $400 transaction. But this is not a story about the $400. This is the story of the hammer, and of the one man in the crowd of 53 people who understood that what was resting on the anvil was worth more than the 112 acres of farmland it sat upon. Let me tell you about the man who had owned the hammer. His name was Silas Croft. He had died 3 months prior, at the age of 98, in the same wood frame house his grandfather had built in 1889. Silas had been a blacksmith, but to say he was a blacksmith is like saying a Stradivari was a violin maker. In the 1950s and early 1960s, a tool from the Croft forge was the standard by which all other tools were judged. Not just in Ohio, but in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the logging camps of Oregon, and the machine shops of Detroit. He made axes that held an edge for 3,000 board feet of timber. He made chisels that could shear a grade 8 bolt without dulling. He made hammers that, in the hands of a master, felt not like a tool, but like an extension of the arm itself. He never advertised. He never signed his work with anything more than a single, small, 5-pointed star stamped into the steel, a mark so subtle you would miss it unless you knew where to look. Then, in the spring of 1976, he stopped. Just stopped. A shipment of 24 custom-made ball-peen hammers for a General Motors plant in Lordstown was his last documented order. He returned the check, sent by mail, with a note that contained only 2 words: no more. He was 51 years old. He lived for another 47 years, but in those 17,155 days, the forge behind his house remained cold. The bellows gathered dust. The slack tub grew a skin of algae. He lived on his savings, which were considerable, and the produce from his garden. He spoke to his neighbors about the weather and the price of corn, but never about steel. The world of men and their machines moved on. New alloys were invented. Computer-controlled mills and induction forges replaced the eye and the arm. Silas Croft, the legend, became Silas Croft, the old recluse on the county line road. When he died, his only living relative was a granddaughter, Sarah, a 28-year-old corporate lawyer from Chicago, who hadn't seen him since she was a child, and who remembered him only as a quiet man who smelled of coal smoke and dirt. She hired an estate liquidation company. Their representative, a man named Mark, 32 years old, with a degree in business administration and 4 years of experience, walked through the forge, saw a pile of what he perceived as rust and decay, and priced it to move. $400. He figured a hobbyist might want the anvil. The man who understood the hammer was named Elias Thorne. Elias was 72 years old, had been a blacksmith for 55 of those years, and was known for 2 things: the preternatural quiet of his movements and his refusal to work with any steel forged after 1980. He lived 15 miles down the road from the old Croft place, in a small house with a tidy forge of his own, a forge that looked, to the untrained eye, almost identical to the one Silas Croft had abandoned. Elias had never met Silas, who was a generation ahead of him, but he had spent his entire life in the man's shadow. His own master, a man named Ben Carter, had owned one Croft hammer, a rounding hammer that was Ben's most prized possession. Ben had spent 2 years on Silas's waiting list in the late 1950s to get it, at a cost of $75. the equivalent of a month's wages. Ben used to say, "You don't swing a croft hammer, you present it to the steel, and it does the work." Let me tell you about Elias. He was not a sentimental man. He was a practitioner. He believed that knowledge was not something you read in a book or learned in a seminar. It was something you earned through sweat and burns and 1,000 failures. Knowledge was calluses on your palms, and the muscle memory that knew the exact shade of orange-yellow that meant a piece of W1 tool steel was at 1,475 degrees Fahrenheit and ready for the quench. He had no patience for the new breed of bladesmiths he saw on television and the internet, with their shiny machines and their talk of thermal cycles and cryo treatments. They were technicians, not smiths. They controlled variables. They did not understand the steel. The steel, to Elias, was not a material. It was a partner, sometimes a recalcitrant one. You didn't tell it what to do. You listened to it. You learned its language. And the only way to listen was through the hammer. The hammer was the smith's voice and his ears. Elias heard about the estate sale from a notice posted on the corkboard at the local feed store. He saw the name, Croft, and his heart, an organ not given to sudden accelerations, beat a little faster. He had no intention of buying anything. He knew the forge would be a ruin, but he felt a duty to go, a duty to bear witness. He arrived late, as was his custom. The small gravel driveway was already full, cars with license plates from 3 different states lining the dirt road for a quarter mile in each direction. Estate sales in the country were a form of entertainment, a social gathering, and a competitive sport. Elias parked his 1998 Ford F-150, a truck with 284,117 miles on the odometer and a driver's side door that had to be closed just so, and walked toward the barn. He moved slowly, his gait measured, his eyes taking in everything. He saw the bargain hunters, the antique dealers with their practiced indifference, the neighbors looking for a piece of local history, and he saw one other person who looked like he might know one end of a hammer from the other. This man was younger, maybe 35. He was tall and lean, with a carefully trimmed beard and expensive-looking work boots that had never seen a muddy field. He was holding a smartphone, taking pictures of a pile of rusted leaf springs. This was Kyle Vance. Kyle was 34 years old, had been a custom knife maker for 6 years, and was known for his popular YouTube channel, Modern Metal. Kyle's workshop, located in a suburban business park outside Columbus, was a 2,500 square foot temple to modern manufacturing. It contained a $40,000 Tormach CNC mill, a $15,000 even heat kiln with digital controllers, and a $12,000 induction forge that could bring a 1-inch bar of steel to welding heat in under 60 seconds. Kyle didn't use hammers for forging. He used a 25-ton hydraulic press with precision milled dies. Hammers were for hobbyists. They were imprecise. They introduced variables. Kyle sold his knives for upwards of $1,500 apiece. They were perfect. Each one was identical to the last, with a Rockwell hardness of 61 HRC, give or take half a point. He was here at the Croft sale because he'd heard there might be some old tool steel, leaf springs, axle shafts that he could buy for scrap prices and use for his Can It Be Forged video series. Also present was Sarah Croft, the granddaughter. She stood by the farmhouse porch talking on her phone, a pained expression on her face. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer and slacks that were not designed for a dusty farm. She looked at the crowd picking over her grandfather's life with a mixture of impatience and disdain. She had a flight back to Chicago at 7 p.m. She needed this to be over. She had a deposition on Monday morning with a pharmaceutical company worth $11 billion. This farm, this pile of memories that were not her own, was a loose end, a complication. When the estate agent, Mark, approached her with a clipboard, she waved him away. "Just sell it all. I don't care what you get. Just get it done." The price he'd put on the forge, $400, seemed high to her. Who would want that pile of junk? So you had the 3 of them, a trinity of perspectives. Sarah, for whom the objects had only a negative value, the cost of the time it took to get rid of them. Kyle, for whom the objects had potential value only as raw material, as content for his digital brand. And Elias, for whom the objects were history, knowledge, and legacy. He walked past Kyle, who was explaining to his phone's camera that old leaf spring steel, 5160 carbon steel, was decent for a beater knife if you could get it cheap. Elias didn't pause. He walked past the chattering crowd. He walked into the cool, dark air of the barn, and his eyes went straight to the anvil. It was a 250-pound Peter Wright, a good English anvil from the late 19th century, but that wasn't what he was looking at. He was looking at the hammer that lay upon it. It's important to understand what a master hammer is. In the world of the handsmith, you don't buy your most important tools, you make them. You forge your own tongs, your own chisels, your own punches. And to do that, you need a hammer. But what do you use to forge the hammer? This is the paradox. The solution is the master hammer. It is the tool, the first hammer, often made by one's own master and given to the apprentice when he strikes out on his own. It is the hammer used to forge all other hammers. It is not just a piece of steel, it is a repository of knowledge. Its balance has to be perfect, not just statically, but dynamically. The peen must be shaped just so, to move metal in a way that is both aggressive and predictable. The face must be hardened to an exact degree. Too soft and it will deform, too hard and it will chip, or worse, it will transfer a brittle hardness to the tools it creates. Silas Croft was legendary for his hammers, but even Silas had a master, a man named Jedediah Hale who had learned the trade after the Civil War. Let me tell you about the wood for the handle. In 1919, Jedediah Hale selected a hickory tree from a ridge in southern Appalachia known for its slow-growing, dense wood. He felled the tree himself, split it, and stacked the wood to season in the rafters of his shop. It seasoned there for 10 years. In 1929, when Silas Croft, then a boy of 14, came to him as an apprentice, that wood was ready. Hale forged a hammerhead from a new type of steel, an alloy with trace amounts of vanadium that was said to be unbreakable. He spent a week just on the heat treatment, a complex, multi-stage process of normalizing, annealing, and quenching that he had developed over 50 years of practice and which he never wrote down. He fitted the head to a handle made from that 10-year seasoned hickory. The hammer weighed exactly 2 pounds, 3 ounces. He gave it to Silas. He said, "This is your teacher now. It will tell you when you are right, and it will punish you when you are wrong. Listen to it." This was the hammer that now lay on the anvil in the dusty Ohio barn. It looked unimpressive. The handle was dark with the oil and sweat of a half-century of use. The head was marked with a few small dings and scratches, the battle scars of a long and productive life. The faces were not mirror-polished like the hammers Kyle Vance sold on his website. They were a smooth, matte grey, the colour of a river stone. Elias Thorne saw none of this. He saw the way the handle was worn down in one specific spot, a testament to a grip that never changed, never faltered. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible curve of the peen, a shape he had seen only once before, on his own master's hammer. He saw the 5-pointed star, no bigger than a pinhead, stamped near the eye of the hammer. He felt a stillness settle over him, the kind of quiet that comes in a cathedral. He had come to bear witness to a ruin. He had found a relic. He stood there for what felt like a long time. People flowed around him, their chatter a meaningless noise. He was not just looking at a hammer, he was looking at a timeline. He saw Jedediah Hale selecting the tree in 1919. He saw a young Silas Croft learning to listen to the ring of the steel in 1929. He saw the thousands of tools that had been born on this anvil under the guidance of this hammer. He saw the pride and the sweat and the knowledge that had been poured into this single object. And he saw the price tag, $400 for the whole assembly. It was a profanity, an insult to the memory of the men who had built a world with their hands. He walked out of the barn, blinking in the sudden sunlight. He found the estate agent, Mark, who was busy trying to sell an old refrigerator. Elias waited patiently, his hands clasped behind his back. When Mark was free, Elias spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. "I'll take the forge." Mark looked him up and down, taking in the worn flannel shirt and the faded jeans. He smiled a professional smile. "The forge, anvil, and tools, $400. It's a great deal. The anvil alone is worth that." Elias nodded. He did not care about the anvil. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted 4 crisp $100 bills. He had gotten them from the bank that morning, just in case. He handed them to Mark. The agent took the money, quickly marked the paper sign on the hay rake as sold, and handed Elias a receipt. "Thank you for your business," he said, already turning to the next customer. The transaction had taken less than a minute. It was completely unremarkable, except for the fact that Kyle Vance had been watching. Kyle had finished his filming for the moment and was wandering through the sale, looking for anything else of value. He had seen the old man staring at the forge. He had seen him pay in cash. He walked over to Elias, a smirk playing on his lips. "You bought that pile of rust?" he asked. His tone was not quite mocking, but it was thick with condescension. Elias turned to look at him. He had seen men like Kyle before. They were full of confidence and data sheets. "It's a forge," Elias said simply. "Yeah, a 19th century forge," Kyle said with a laugh. "My induction heater can get a billet to 1,950 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 5 degrees, in 90 seconds. It's programmable, repeatable. What can that coal pit do?" The question was rhetorical, a display of his own superiority. Elias considered the question. He looked at the barn, then back at Kyle. He said, "It makes a tool." Kyle scoffed. "You can make a tool with a rock if you want. It's all about the metallurgy, the process control, the grain structure. You can't get any of that with a primitive setup like this. That hammer, for instance." He pointed toward the barn. "What's the HRC on that? What's the alloy? You don't know. It's all guesswork. My hammers are CNC milled from a solid block of S7 tool steel, vacuum heat treated to a precise 58 Rockwell. There's no guesswork. It's science." Elias stood there, his face unreadable. He had heard these arguments for 30 years. They were the arguments of men who trusted machines more than they trusted their own hands. He did not want to argue. He wanted to take his prize and go home. But there was a small crowd gathering, a few local farmers, another old-timer who had a small machine shop, even Sarah, the granddaughter, who had drifted over, drawn by the hint of a confrontation. The public nature of the challenge required a response. The honor of the hammer required a response. He looked at Kyle, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not anger, but a kind of weary resolve, showed in his eyes. He said, "The science is in the hammer, not in a book." This was too much for Kyle. The old man was not just ignorant, he was defiant. "Okay," Kyle said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher about to conduct a demonstration for a slow student. "Okay, let's see it. Let's see the science. I'll tell you what." He walked over to his truck, a brand new Ford F350 with his Modern Metal logo emblazoned on the side. He opened a heavy-duty toolbox in the bed and pulled something out. It was a block of steel, about 4 inches long and 2 inches square. It was polished to a mirror finish. He walked back and held it out. "And this is a test block, the 2-tool steel. I had it professionally heat-treated and cryo-tempered to 64 HRC. That's harder than a file, harder than any chisel you can buy. You can't cut it, you can't even scratch it with a standard carbide scriber. I use it to test the edges of my knives." He looked around at the crowd, making sure he had their attention. "You say that old forge can make a tool. Fine, make a tool, make a chisel that can put a mark in this block." He tossed the block, and it landed on the ground with a heavy thud. "If you can do that," he said, a wide, confident grin spreading across his face, "I'll buy this whole farm from the lady here for what the developers are offering, right now, in cash." A gasp went through the small crowd. Sarah Croft's head snapped up. The developers had offered her $350,000 for the 112 acres, an offer she was planning to accept on Monday. It was a low-ball offer, but it was fast, and she wanted fast. Kyle Vance was making a bet worth $1/3 million, just to humiliate an old man. He was that confident, that certain of his own modern scientific worldview. He thought he was betting on a chisel, but he was betting against 100 years of accumulated knowledge. He was betting against Jedediah Hale's hickory tree. Silence descended. Everyone looked at Elias. This was no longer a simple disagreement. It was a public challenge, a trial by fire. Sarah stepped forward, her lawyerly instincts taking over. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. "My grandfather's property isn't a stage for some pissing contest." But her voice lacked conviction. The offer hung in the air, a tantalizing, impossible sum of money. Kyle ignored her. His eyes were locked on Elias. "What's the matter, old man?" he goaded. "Can't your magic hammer do it?" Elias Thorne did not look at Kyle. He did not look at Sarah or the crowd. He looked toward the barn, at the dark opening that held the forge. He had wanted to take the hammer home, to clean it, to honor it in private, but that was no longer possible. The hammer's reputation, and the reputation of the entire world it represented, had been called into question. It had to be defended, here, now. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was barely a movement, but in the thick silence, it felt like a thunderclap. He turned and walked back into the barn. The crowd, as one, followed him. Let me tell you about starting a forge that has been cold for 47 years. It is not a simple act. It is a resurrection. Elias didn't rush. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. First, he swept the floor around the forge, clearing away decades of dust and debris. He found a bag of coal, miraculously dry, tucked away in a metal bin. It was high-quality anthracite, the kind that burns hot and clean. Silas had been prepared. Elias inspected the bellows. The leather was cracked and dry. It would not hold air. The crowd murmured. Kyle, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, allowed himself a small smile. The show was over before it began. Elias did not even glance at the bellows. He walked over to a corner of the barn and began rummaging through a pile of what looked like junk. He pulled out a long, flexible metal pipe and a strange-looking metal fan with a hand crank. It was a hand-cranked blower, the kind used by farriers. Not as efficient as bellows, but reliable. He spent 10 minutes attaching it to the forge's tuyere, the pipe that introduces air into the fire. He worked in silence, his hands sure and steady. He found a bucket, filled it with water from a spigot outside, and placed it near the anvil. This was the slack tub for quenching the hot steel. Then he turned his attention to the anvil. He took a clean rag from his back pocket and wiped down the face, clearing away the dust of half a century. Then he did something that made Kyle Vance roll his eyes. He laid his palm flat on the cold steel for a full 30 seconds, his eyes closed. He was not praying. He was listening. He was feeling the resonance of the anvil, getting a sense of its hardness, its character. Finally, he picked up the hammer. He didn't swing it. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight, its balance. He ran his thumb over the worn hickory of the handle. He was reestablishing a connection that had been broken for 17,155 days. He was waking it up. He placed a small handful of kindling in the forge pot and lit it with a wooden match. Once the wood was burning steadily, he added a few small shovelfuls of coal. He began to turn the crank on the blower, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. A plume of thick, acrid smoke filled the barn, and people started to cough. Then, as the fire caught, the smoke thinned and a warm orange glow began to emanate from the heart of the forge. The sound was a low whisper, the sound of air breathing life into coal. Elias stood and watched the fire, his expression unchanging. He was not just heating coal. He was creating the heart of his operation, a small, controllable sun. He waited. He waited for the color to be right, for the heat to be even. It took 20 minutes. To Kyle, watching from the doorway, this was an eternity of wasted time. To Elias, it was the necessary first step. Patience was an ingredient as vital as the coal or the steel. While the fire was coming to temperature, he selected his material. He did not go for the old leaf springs Kyle had been filming. He went to a rack on the wall and selected a long, thin bar of steel. It was covered in rust, but Elias could see what it was. It was a piece of an old file, probably a Nicholson, made from W1 tool steel. High carbon, simple to work with, capable of taking a very hard edge if treated properly. He used a hacksaw to cut off a 6-inch section. He now had his fire, his water, his steel, and his hammer. He was ready. He placed the end of the steel bar into the heart of the fire. He did not bury it. He laid it gently on the glowing coals, turning it slowly. The crowd was silent now. The only sounds were the whisper of the blower and the crackle of the coal. Sarah Croft stood near the front, her arms wrapped around herself, her phone forgotten in her pocket. She was watching not just a man working, but a ritual unfolding, a piece of her own unknown history coming to life. When the steel reached a bright orange yellow, Elias pulled it from the fire. He moved with a swift, fluid motion, fire to anvil in less than a second. And then the hammer fell. The sound was not the dull clang of metal on metal that most people associate with a blacksmith. It was a clear, high-pitched ring, a bell. Ting, ting, ting-a-ling. The hammer seemed to bounce off the steel as if it were alive. Elias was not pounding the metal into submission, he was coaxing it. He used the peen to draw the metal out, lengthening it. He used the face to flatten it, shaping it. He worked in a rhythm, a 3-beat pattern. Ting, ting, talk. Ting, ting, talk. The steel seemed to melt under the hammer, flowing like clay. He took 3 heats. 3 times he returned the steel to the fire. 3 times he brought it to the anvil. In less than 5 minutes, the rough bar of steel had become the unmistakable shape of a chisel. He took a final heat, a lower heat, just a dull, cherry red. This was the normalizing heat, to relieve the stresses in the steel from the forging. Then he let it cool on the edge of the anvil. While it cooled, he went to the grinding wheel. It was an old, foot-powered stone wheel. He pumped the pedal, and a low rumble filled the barn. He dressed the wheel, then carefully ground the cutting edge of the chisel to a precise 70-degree angle. He did not use a guide, he did it by eye, his hands as steady as a surgeon's. Now came the most critical part, the heat treatment, the hardening. Anyone could forge a piece of steel into the shape of a chisel, but the magic, the science that Kyle Vance was so proud of, was in the hardening. Elias placed the tip of the chisel back into the fire. He watched it with an intensity that was almost painful. He was not looking at the whole chisel, only the last half-inch. He watched as the color ran up the steel, from a pale straw yellow to a brown, to a purple, to a deep blue. Just as the blue reached the cutting edge, he plunged it into the slack tub. A violent hiss, a cloud of steam. He held it there for exactly 3 seconds, then pulled it out. The hardening was done, but he wasn't finished. The edge was now glass hard, but also glass brittle. It needed to be tempered, to trade some of its hardness for toughness. He quickly polished the cutting edge with a piece of sandstone to reveal the bare metal. Then he held the body of the chisel, still hot from the forge, near the edge. He was using the residual heat in the tool to temper itself. He watched as the colors ran again across the polished edge. Straw, brown, purple. He was looking for a specific shade of dark straw, almost brown, the color that represented a hardness of around 62 HRC, but with enough toughness to withstand a shock. When the color reached the very tip of the cutting edge, he quenched the entire tool in the bucket of water. The process was complete. The whole thing, from lighting the fire to the final quench, had taken less than an hour. Elias laid the finished chisel on the anvil. It was not pretty. It was a tool, not a piece of art. The body was still covered in the black scale from the forge, except for the brightly polished, straw-colored cutting edge. He picked up the hammer, the master hammer, and held it in his hand. He looked at Kyle, who was still standing in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and contempt. Elias didn't say a word. He simply nodded toward the A2 steel block that lay on the floor. A young man from the crowd, a farmhand, picked up the polished block and placed it on the anvil. It sat there, a perfect, gleaming monument to modern metallurgy. It looked inviolable. Kyle walked forward, his confidence returning. "Go on, then," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see it. Let's see you scratch my block with your lump of rust." Elias did not look at him. He picked up the chisel he had just made. It was still warm. He held it in his left hand, its point resting on the center of the gleaming block of A2 steel. He held it perfectly vertical. He took a breath. He raised the master hammer. Not high, just to the level of his shoulder. The barn was so quiet you could hear the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeams slanting through the boards. He held the hammer there for a beat, a moment of perfect stillness. Then he brought it down. It was not a mighty blow. It was a tap, a single, sharp, decisive tap. The sound was not a clang or a thud. It was a pure, clean, resonant crack, like a branch snapping in a winter forest. It was over in an instant. Elias removed the chisel. He set it down. He stepped back from the anvil. He had done his part. The rest was for the world to see. Kyle Vance pushed through the small crowd that had gathered around the anvil. He leaned over, a smug look on his face, ready to declare victory. He looked at the block. The smug look vanished. His face went pale. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the surface of the steel. There, in the dead center of the mirror-polished, cryogenically treated 64 Rockwell Hardness A 2-tool steel block, was a mark. It was not a scratch. It was a cut. A perfect square indentation, about a 1/16 of an inch deep. The edges were sharp and clean, as if they'd been machined. Kyle looked from the mark on the block to the chisel lying on the anvil. The chisel's edge was pristine. Not a chip, not a roll, not a mark on it. He looked at the old, quiet man standing by the forge. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He had built his career, his identity, his entire worldview on a set of principles, on data and specifications. And in one sharp crack, this old man and his pile of rust had shattered them all. He had seen the impossible happen. A tool forged in less than an hour, in a primitive forge, from a piece of scrap, had cut a material that was, by all scientific measures, uncuttable. The crowd was silent for a moment, processing what they had seen. Then an old farmer in the back started to clap. A slow, rhythmic clap. Another joined in, and another. Soon the entire barn, save for Kyle and Sarah, was filled with applause. It was not applause for a trick. It was applause for a truth that they all understood in their bones. A truth about work and knowledge and the things that endure. Kyle Vance did not say another word. He turned, pushed his way through the crowd, and walked out of the barn. He got in his big clean truck and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust on the gravel road. He did not honor his bet. Nobody expected him to. His humiliation was payment enough. Sarah Croft was the only one not clapping. She was staring at the mark on the steel block. She was a lawyer. She dealt in facts, in evidence, and the evidence before her was irrefutable. She walked over to Elias, who was now quietly wiping down the hammer with his rag, preparing to put it away. What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you do that?" Elias finished wiping the hammer. He held it for a moment, then laid it gently back on the anvil, face down, exactly as he had found it. He looked at Sarah, and his eyes were not triumphant. They were sad. "I didn't do anything," he said. "It was the hammer. It told the steel what to do." He looked around the dusty forge and the cold anvil and the dying fire. This was his church. He said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, "Your grandfather's." Sarah stood there amidst the dust and the smell of coal and the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten projects. The $350,000 offer from the developers felt like a cheap insult now. The flight to Chicago, the deposition, the entire world she had built for herself felt thin and unimportant. She had come here to liquidate an asset. She had discovered a legacy. She made a decision. It was not a logical decision. It was not based on a cost-benefit analysis. It was based on the sound of a single hammer strike. "Don't sell the farm," she said to the estate agent, who was standing dumbfounded by the door. Then she turned back to Elias. Will you teach me?" she asked. "About this? About him?" Elias Thorne looked at the young woman, at her expensive clothes and her manicured hands. He saw the desperation and the hope in her eyes. He saw the ghost of Silas Croft standing behind her. He gave a slow nod. "The first lesson," he said, "is to sweep the floor." And that is how the Croft farm was saved. Sarah did not go back to Chicago that night. She canceled her flight. On Monday, she called the senior partner at her law firm and requested an indefinite leave of absence. She did not, as she expected, become Elias Thorne's apprentice in the traditional sense. He did not give her lectures on metallurgy or demonstrate forging techniques. The first week, he had her do nothing but clean. She swept the floors of the barn and the house. She washed the windows. She pulled weeds in the overgrown garden. She was learning the rhythm of the place. The second week, he had her sort scrap, piles of it. She learned to tell a leaf spring from an axle shaft by feel, a file from a rasp by the sound it made when dropped. She was learning the language of the material. It was a year before he let her light the forge. It was another 6 months before he let her touch the master hammer. He never praised her. He never yelled. When she made a mistake, and she made many, he would simply pick up the failed piece, look at it, and say, "What did the steel tell you?" She learned that success was not in the finished product, but in the listening. Elias Thorne died peacefully in his sleep 9 years later, at the age of 81. He left his own forge and all his tools to Sarah. By then, she was no longer a lawyer from Chicago. She was a blacksmith. Her hands were calloused and strong. She could tell the temperature of steel by its color, its hardness by the sound of the quench. She was not as good as her grandfather. She was not as good as Elias. But she was a keeper of the flame. The farm was never sold. Sarah established a trust, the Croft Thorne Legacy, a small foundation dedicated to preserving the craft of hand forging. She took on a few students, not apprentices, but serious practitioners who wanted to learn the old ways. Kyle Vance's Modern Metal YouTube channel went dark about 3 years after the estate sale. During the economic downturn of 2028, the rising cost of electricity for his induction forge and the specialized materials for his CNC mill made his business model unsustainable. His methods, so perfectly optimized for a single set of economic conditions, were too rigid to adapt. He declared bankruptcy. The last anyone heard, he was a shift manager at a home improvement store. Sometimes, late at night, when the work is done and the forge is cooling, Sarah will take out the master hammer. She will hold it in her hands, the hickory handle now worn smooth by her own grip. She understands now. The hammer is not magic. It is a vessel. It contains the distilled knowledge of generations. It contains the patience of a man who would season wood for a decade, the focus of a man who could see the soul of the steel in the color of the flame, the humility of a man who understood that he was not a master of the steel, but its servant. The value of a thing is not its price. It is not the sum of its materials or the efficiency of its production. The value of a thing is the story it tells. And the story of this hammer, a story that could be bought for $400 but was worth a lifetime to understand, was a story about what it means to be truly connected to your work, to your history, and to the world itself. What is rigid breaks. What adapts, what listens, what has deep roots, that is what endures.